We would like to know which locations and what times of day or night these documented stories reach, so before we start, I ask you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the precise time you are listening to this narration. Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases documented in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. When the residents of Taney County, Missouri, noticed something strange about the Caldwell property on the outskirts of Hollister in 1926, spring had just started to soften the rocky Ozark Mountains landscape. The once immaculate white farmhouse with its wraparound porch had been neglected during the winter, and the flower beds that Catherine Caldwell had painstakingly tended every season since her marriage in 1918 were still in ruins, choked with weeds and the remains of the previous year's blooms. When asked why his wife had been absent for so long, Thomas would respond, "She's visiting her sister in Springfield. The poor thing's been sick with consumption, and Catherine's always been devoted to family." The explanation seemed plausible enough to most. The winter had been especially hard that year, with heavy snowfall isolating many of the more remote properties in the region, and the Caldwells had always kept to themselves, even in the best of times. The neighbors would later inform authorities that they hadn't seen Catherine since late November 1925, although her husband Thomas continued his weekly trips into town for supplies. There was, however, a change in Thomas Caldwell's disposition, according to Evelyn Porter, who ran the general store with her husband. "His eyes never settled on anything for too long," she wrote in her statement to the county sheriff, "and he started buying unusual quantities of lye and carbolic acid, said that it was done to clear the well. However, in the dead of winter, who cleans a well?" Nobody formally recognized Catherine's disappearance until April 16, 1926, when local mail carrier Samuel Thornton delivered a registered letter addressed to Catherine requiring her signature. Thornton, who had known the Caldwells for years, noted the pungent odor of chemical preservatives emanating from the cellar door, and something about Thomas's placement between Thornton and the house's entrance aroused the mail carrier's suspicions. Sheriff James Holloway and 2 deputies arrived at the Caldwell farm within 3 days, and what they found in the root cellar under the kitchen would turn out to be one of the most unsettling cases in Ozark history. However, most of the records were sealed until 1962, when a fire at the county records office destroyed most of the original files, leaving only a few photographs and partial transcripts that have since been the focus of much conjecture. Before he could be questioned, Thomas Caldwell was discovered hanging from a beam in the barn, leaving behind a notebook that would only add to the mystery surrounding his wife's disappearance. The first entry, made on December 3, 1925, simply stated, "She isn't Catherine anymore." Thomas had inherited the 80-acre farm from his father, along with a small amount that enabled the couple to update the house with indoor plumbing, a luxury few in the area could afford. The early 20th century had been hard for the area around Hollister, Missouri, with the lumber industry that had once flourished in decline and many families struggling to maintain their properties. The Caldwells, however, appeared to fare better than most. Mabel Jenkins, a neighbor who lived 3 miles down the road, told investigators that Catherine, whose real name was Catherine Elizabeth Harlow, came from a well-respected family in Springfield and had trained as a nurse during the Great War, but she never practiced professionally after marrying Thomas in 1918. She was known to experiment with herbal remedies, maintain a beautiful garden, and preserve food for the winter. She knew every plant in these hills. She told investigators, adding that people would travel from all over when they needed something the Branson doctor couldn't fix. She had an almost eerie ability to cure illnesses. This reputation would eventually play a big part in the unsettling story that came out of the Caldwell farm. Outside observers saw the marriage as stable. Thomas as quiet but hard-working, a man who kept the farm running smoothly despite the economic difficulties. Catherine as the more outgoing of the two, though even she maintained a certain reserve that some attributed to her upbringing and others to a natural shyness. But few realized that tensions had been building beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful existence, as evidenced by Thomas's journal, which became the main source of information after his suicide. In an October 1925 entry, he noted, "Catherine spent 3 hours in the woods today. When she came back, her basket was empty, but her apron was soiled with something dark." By 1924, Thomas's resentment had clearly hardened into something darker. "She speaks to something in the night," he wrote. "I hear her through the wall, whispering in a voice that doesn't sound like hers." The couple didn't have children, a fact that seemed to weigh heavily on Thomas, as several entries in his journal mentioned Catherine's failure and unwillingness to bear him an heir. The Caldwell property remained strangely verdant. Their well never ran dry, and their garden continued to produce, while others withered. That was a turning point in the summer of 1925, when a severe drought hit much of the Ozarks, and many farms suffered. Thomas attributed this anomaly to Catherine's unnatural knowledge, and became convinced that she was practicing practices that went beyond simple folk remedies. "The shed behind the smokehouse is locked," he wrote in August 1925. "I've seen the light through the cracks, and I've heard the sounds. Not animal, not human, something in between." It is unclear from the surviving records exactly what Thomas thought his wife was doing. When authorities searched the property, they discovered the shed he mentioned empty. Although they did note that the dirt floor looked as if it had recently been dug up and replaced, no excavation was ordered at the time, a decision that would later be criticized when interest in the case resurfaced. Thomas's diary entries became more and more irregular as autumn wore on, describing improbable changes in Catherine's appearance and behavior, including claims that her eyes had changed color, her voice had deepened, and that she occasionally went days without eating or sleeping. What was most unsettling, though, were his descriptions of discovering odd markings carved into the door frames and beneath the furniture symbols he didn't recognize, but thought were intended to bind him to the property. With symptoms of dizziness, blurred vision, and a persistent taste of metal in his mouth, Thomas's paranoia escalated in the last months of 1925, leading him to suspect Catherine was poisoning him. Medical experts, who later reviewed the case, suggested that these symptoms could have been arsenic poisoning, since arsenic is a common ingredient in some pesticides and could be easily accessible to someone with Catherine's chemistry knowledge, or that Thomas himself might have been suffering from ergot poisoning, a condition caused by fungus-contaminated grain that can cause hallucinations and paranoia. The last time anyone saw Catherine alive was on the 28th of November, 1925, when she bought supplies at Porter's General Store, where Evelyn Porter remembered that Catherine appeared preoccupied and bought an odd quantity of salt and several yards of white muslin cloth. By November, Thomas had resorted to sleeping in the barn, only coming inside during the day when he thought it safe to do so. He also stopped eating anything Catherine prepared and started taking careful notes on her whereabouts. The events of the last days of November are still unknown, as there is a considerable lapse in Thomas's journal between November 29 and December 3, when he resumed his entries. The first words he used were the cryptic, "She isn't Catherine anymore." The pages that followed described a complex preservation process, written in such clinical terms that investigators initially assumed Thomas must have had medical training that was unknown at the time, describing the use of techniques he claimed to have learned from her books, which were never recovered, and matching methods of chemical embalming, albeit with odd modifications involving herbal solutions and ceremonial placement. On that April day in 1926, Sheriff Holloway and his deputies went down into the Caldwell cellar, expecting to find Catherine's body, but instead, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cellar had been altered, with symbols drawn on the walls in what later analysis determined to be a mixture of ash, red clay, and organic material containing human blood. A perfect circle had been inscribed in the middle of the dirt floor, with 7 glass jars arranged in a particular pattern inside, each containing preserved human tissue, organs that the medical examiner would later confirm belonged to a single adult female. The most unsettling aspect of the scene was what Thomas called the vessel in his last journal entries. What appeared to be a life-size doll of white muslin cloth, partially hidden behind preserved food stores in the northwest corner of the cellar, was painstakingly fashioned to resemble a human form, with facial features delicately embroidered in black thread, and inside, packed tightly with a mixture of salt, dried herbs, and what the medical examiner recognized as human hair and nail clippings, were Catherine's bones, precisely articulated and positioned to preserve the proper anatomical position. The skull was absent. 3 days before to the postal carrier's visit, on the 13th of April 1926, Thomas wrote in his last journal, "I hear her voice from the woods now. She's located another ship. I couldn't keep her in check. May God have mercy on us all." Despite local trackers noticing odd patterns of disturbed foliage stretching from the property toward an area locals called Stillhouse Hollow, no bodies were ever discovered during a search of the surrounding woodland. The case was closed in June 1926. Catherine was pronounced dead. Thomas was identified as her killer, and the property was eventually sold at auction, though it would change hands several times over the next few decades, becoming known for being unhealthy or unlucky for its occupants. The investigation officially concluded that Thomas Caldwell had murdered his wife while in a state of mental deterioration, possibly suffering from delusions fueled by isolation and underlying psychological issues. If it weren't for Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a folklorist from the University of Missouri who started studying Ozark traditions in the late 1952, she would have lost interest in the Caldwell case completely. As she interviewed people about local healing practices, she kept coming across references to a wise woman who had lived in the 1922 near Hollister. These descriptions matched Catherine Caldwell, but none of her informants used that name. Instead, they spoke of a woman known as Aunt Kathy, or occasionally the Lady of the Roots, who was said to have had an unusual connection to the land, who could speak to the growing things, and who knew secrets about the natural world that were beyond common knowledge. Most intriguingly, a few elderly informants stated that this woman hadn't passed away, but had gone back to the forest when her time in human form was complete. Her curiosity was aroused, and in 1962 she requested access to the Caldwell case files, only to discover that many had been destroyed in the fire at the county records office. Nevertheless, the fragments that survived were detailed enough to persuade Dr. Marsh that something more complicated than a straightforward murder had taken place at the Caldwell farm, and she started a methodical investigation, locating surviving witnesses and family members of those involved. Her most important finding came in 1964 when she found Catherine's younger sister, Virginia Harlow Peters, in a Springfield nursing home. At first, Virginia, who was in her 70s at the time, refused to talk about her sister, but after multiple visits, she revealed a family secret that changed the course of the case. Catherine had not been born a Harlow. She had been discovered as a 3-year-old girl, unable to speak and without identification, wandering in the woods near the family's summer cabin in Shannon County in 1896. The Harlows, who had just lost their own daughter to diphtheria, took in the feral child and reared her as their own, fabricating an origin story about her that they continued to this day. Catherine was different from the beginning, Virginia explained to Dr. Marsh. She quickly picked up speech, but she never seemed to fully grasp certain human customs. She needed to learn from her mother the fundamentals that most kids naturally understand, such how to smile in social settings, when to express emotion, and why some subjects shouldn't be spoken in polite company. Virginia's recollection of Catherine's repeated childhood claim that she remembered the trees from inside was the most illuminating. When asked what this might mean, Virginia would only respond that their parents had forbade any discussion of Catherine's fancies and had eventually sent her to a strict boarding school where such talk was discouraged. But she never forgot, Virginia recalled, and she wrote in a language she believed the forest taught her, and she maintained diaries full with pictures of plants no one had ever seen. The link between this strange childhood and the woman who later became famous for her eerily accurate knowledge of plants seemed obvious to Dr. Marsh, who speculated that Catherine may have experienced trauma prior to being discovered by the Harlows, developing an odd obsession with nature as a coping mechanism which, along with her loneliness at the Caldwell farm and her husband's growing instability, could account for the strange events that followed her disappearance. The missing skull presented a unique puzzle. The ritual arrangement of the cellar scene suggested knowledge that went beyond Ozark folk traditions. and the most concerning were the reports from locals that they saw a woman who looked like Catherine wandering the forests surrounding Stillhouse Hollow for years after her presumed death. During a visit to the former Caldwell property, which is now owned by a retired couple from Street Lewis who used it as a summer residence, in 1965, Dr. Marsh's research took an unexpected turn. As she examined the area where the shed had once been, she found a small metal box buried about 2 feet below the surface, containing a leather-bound journal written in what appeared to be Catherine's hand, though the writing deteriorated over the last pages into an erratic scrawl that didn't resemble the neat penmanship of the earlier entries. The journal told a story very different from Thomas's. Catherine wrote in it that she became increasingly aware that her husband had started poisoning her in the summer of 1925, apparently convinced that she was a witch, and that she was experiencing symptoms such as hair loss, discolored nails, and increasing weakness, and that she would not be able to survive the winter if she stayed. He believes I don't notice the bitter taste in the coffee, the strange powder he mixes into my portion of stew, she wrote in October 1925. I've been throwing out food when he isn't watching, but I am becoming weaker every day. Now more than ever, the forest is calling to me. Although it provides protection, the cost is high. The last entries were more enigmatic, mentioning a procedure that would enable her to shed what was borrowed and return to the true form. To return, I must leave behind what was never truly mine. On the 30th of November 1925, the final logical entry stated, "Tonight I begin the separation. The ship will always be there as proof of what was done to me." The essence returns to the dark waiting. By the time Thomas finds out what he has made, I will be out of his grasp. Disappointed but unfazed, Dr. Marsh focused on similar cases throughout the Ozark region where people with unusual connections to the natural world had met mysterious ends. In 1966, she tried to publish her findings in an academic journal, but her work was rejected as speculative and sensationalistic. Dr. Marsh vanished in 1968 while exploring an area near Stillhouse Hollow. Her car was found parked at a trailhead with her research materials neatly organized inside. But no trace of the folklorist herself was ever found. The official report concluded that she had probably fallen into one of the many caves or sinkholes that plagued the area, though no body was recovered. There was one last interesting detail in her notes, which were eventually archived at the university. "The eyes are wrong," she wrote in the margin of her field journal, next to an interview with an old man who said he had seen a woman walking into Stillhouse Hollow on moonlit nights, reflecting light like an animal's and changing color with the seasons. A potential link to Thomas's journal. Following a review by state authorities, the Caldwell case files were formally sealed in 1969, citing lack of ongoing investigative value and sensitivity to local concerns, though some have suggested that the decision was more motivated by the unsettling implications of Dr. Marsh's research and her subsequent disappearance. The land surrounding the former Caldwell property has been mostly reclaimed by forest in the decades since, and despite Stillhouse Hollow's potential scenic value, development has avoided the area because of what locals call an unwholesome atmosphere that lingers even during the day. In the early spring and late autumn, when Ozark folklore says the line between worlds becomes increasingly thin, hikers have reported seeing a female figure who watches from between the trees but disappears when approached. One of the most unsettling unanswered questions in the Missouri Ozarks is what actually happened to Catherine Caldwell during the winter of 1925-1926. Was she, as official records indicate, the victim of a mentally ill husband who killed her and made up a story to explain it? Or was she, as her own journal indicates, gradually poisoned and forced to take drastic measures to get away? Or was there some deeper truth to the local legends? Some connection between the untamed child discovered in the woods and the creature that is said to still roam the forested hollows? Perhaps the most troubling question is the one that Thomas's last journal entry raises. If Catherine found another vessel, what or who has been walking the hills around Hollister for almost a century? When a surveyor for the Missouri Highway Department reported finding a human skull in a small cave near Stillhouse Hollow in 1966, the skull had vanished by the time authorities arrived to investigate. But the surveyor's photographs clearly showed a cranium with unusual deformities in the occipital region, deformities that one medical examiner suggested were consistent with abnormal brain development. Robert Hayes, the surveyor, claimed to have felt watched during his time in the area and to have heard a woman's voice singing in non-English just before he found the skull. Despite being paid more, he refused to return to the site, saying he would rather lose his job than go back into those woods. The most disturbing was probably Hayes's account of discovering a small cloth doll near the skull, made of what looked like white muslin, with a black thread-embroidered face that matched no known folk art tradition. The doll was not there when authorities searched the cave, but Hayes's detailed sketch revealed a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and features that appeared purposefully distorted. "It wasn't meant to be a person," Hayes wrote in his report. "It was meant to be something pretending to be a person." In 1972, the Caldwell property was bought by a development company with plans to build a lakeside resort. Construction started in the spring of 1973, but was stopped that summer when 3 workers saw a woman who matched Catherine's description standing at the edge of the forest. Watching the original farmhouse being demolished, all 3 men quit within days of the sighting, describing a sense of overwhelming hostility emanating from the surrounding woods. The half-finished structures were eventually reclaimed by the elements, their concrete foundations now barely discernible under decades of vegetation. The land was officially designated as Mark Twain National Forest in 1981, effectively banning any further development. Today, only the most determined hikers venture into the area, and local guides will not lead tours anywhere near the location of the former Caldwell house. Those who do venture into the remote parts of the forest occasionally report finding small arrangements of stones or twisted branches that form symbols similar to those described in the sheriff's report from 1926. Configurations that appear overnight and are never in the same place twice. Wildlife behaves strangely in the area. Birds fall silent, deer stand motionless, watching from a distance. And trail cameras often malfunction or only capture blurred images of what appears to be a lone human figure moving between the trees at unexpected speeds. In 1985, Marcus Y., a forestry technician assigned to a survey of tree diseases in the area, provided one particularly unsettling account. Y., a 15-year veteran of the Forest Service, who colleagues described as level-headed and not prone to fancy, spent 3 weeks cataloging specimens throughout the area. His field reports methodical and unremarkable until his last day in the vicinity of the old Caldwell property. "I've been hearing movement in the underbrush for days," Y said. "At first, I thought it was a black bear or possibly a deer, but the pattern is incorrect. It moves as I move, and it stops when I stop. I finally got to see her today. Approximately 50 yards away from the route was a woman dressed in vintage clothing. She turned to face me when I cried out, and I swear to God her expression altered. One moment it was a woman's face, and the next it was nothing I could explain. Then another woman appeared." Y's supervisor observed that the technician seemed quite upset when he returned to headquarters and that he resigned from the Forest Service 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. "I'm requesting reassignment, effective immediately. Some things you see change the way you understand the world," Y said in a 1992 interview with a PhD student studying Ozark folklore. But he would not go into further detail about his encounter. "I no longer go into the woods. No forests, no place." When the excavation of a previously undiscovered cave system about 3 miles from the former Caldwell property in 1989 for the construction of a new highway between Branson and Hollister uncovered evidence of human habitation. Spanning several thousand years, including odd pictographs that bore striking resemblances to the symbols described in the 1926 sheriff's report from the Caldwell cellar, another layer of the Caldwell mystery was revealed. The most interesting was a central figure that seemed to be emerging from, or merging with, a stylized forest. According to Dr. Michael Redford, the archaeologist who led the assessment, the pictographs seemed to show a process of transformation. Human figures gradually taking on characteristics of trees or plants. The pictographs were created by late woodland or early Mississippian cultures, as indicated by carbon dating of organic material found near them, which placed them between 900 and 1000 CE. The iconography suggests a belief in entities that existed at the intersection of human and plant life, Dr. Redford wrote. Similar motifs appear in certain obscure folk traditions throughout the Ozarks, particularly in stories about forest wives or green women who were said to emerge from the woods during times of drought or famine, bringing knowledge of healing plants before eventually returning to their original homes in the deep forest. Researchers familiar with both were aware of the possible connection between these ancient beliefs and the Caldwell case, but formal investigation was thwarted when the cave system was sealed during highway construction, despite protests from the archaeological team. The official reason given was structural instability, but there were rumors that the decision was made for safety reasons. But the decision was made by a much higher level of the state government than would typically be involved in such matters. Using techniques developed for paranormal research, a group of folklore students from the University of Arkansas attempted an overnight investigation at the former Caldwell property in 2002, setting up equipment to record ambient sounds and temperature fluctuations. The group left their camp shortly after midnight, leaving most of their equipment behind, and when interviewed later, they refused to discuss specific details of what they had experienced, but they did mention movement patterns that defied natural explanation and vocalizations that mimicked human speech. At around 11:47 p.m., a woman's voice can be heard at the very edge of audibility, speaking in what linguistics experts identified as a heavily altered form of Elizabethan English, interspersed with sounds that have no equivalent in any known language. The final moments of the recording include what sound like footsteps approaching the microphone, followed by a whispered phrase that audio analysts have interpreted as, "Still wearing borrowed skin." The one recording that survived their hurried departure captured only forest sounds for the first 3 hours. I still have the ability to be. The recording concludes with the sound of equipment toppling over and the terrified screams of the students running from the scene, still watching what was mine. Following this incident, Melissa Carter, the group's leader, experienced what her medical records describe as acute stress reaction with dissociative features. She spent 3 weeks in psychiatric care before continuing her studies, and after graduating, she wrote a thesis titled Liminal Entities in Ozark Folklore, the Intersection of Memory and Landscape, which alluded to her experience but did not specifically mention the Caldwell case. Carter, however, wrote in a private letter to her faculty advisor, "What we encountered wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It wasn't a semblance of a deceased person's consciousness. It was something that had worn humans, like a garment for a while, then thrown away when it was no longer useful. It also keeps us in mind. The scariest aspect is that it recalls the experience of being one of us." We don't know where Carter is now, but she never went back to field work and finally left academia altogether, and it watches us with something between curiosity and hunger. Those who study American folklore and the paranormal became more interested in the Caldwell case in the years that followed, but most investigations produced little more than what was already known, and locals became tired of outsiders asking about the woman in the woods and generally refused to talk about it with strangers. One such local was Walter Pruitt, whose family had been in the area since before the Civil War, who, in an interview with a local historian in 2007 at the age of 93, asserted that there had been tales of entities living in the deep forests of the Ozarks before European settlers arrived. "My grandmother's grandma was Cherokee," Pruitt recalled, and she recounted stories of the elderly people who lived in the trees. Not quite spirits, but also not flesh, as you and I are. Something in the middle that could change form when necessary. The majority remained deep in the forest, but sometimes one would become interested in people and attempt to live among them for a while. It never ended well. They couldn't keep up the disguise indefinitely. Pruitt was evasive when asked if he thought Catherine Caldwell might have been one of these things, stating, "I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no." And when people discovered what they truly were, there was turmoil. However, My father was acquainted with Thomas Caldwell, and he consistently asserted that Thomas was not insane as some had stated. Scared to death, perhaps, but not insane. 3 weeks after the interview, Pruitt passed away in his sleep, saying, "She's standing right outside the window," in his final coherent words. He saw something that wasn't supposed to be seen, and it broke him. She still has the same appearance as she did then. A sealed envelope marked private to be destroyed upon my death, which had apparently gone unnoticed when the sheriff's office was cleared after his death in 1953, was among the personal belongings of Sheriff James Holloway, who had led the initial investigation of the Caldwell case and which was donated anonymously to the Taney County Historical Society in 2013. Inside the envelope was a single page of notes written in Holloway's hand on the 20th of April 1926, the day after Thomas Caldwell's body was found. "I discovered something today that I am unable to include in the formal report. A guy might stand in the hollow of an ancient oak tree at the edge of the woods behind the Caldwell residence." I discovered a pile of what appeared to be discarded skin inside the hollow. It was dry and colorless, like a snake's shedding, but it was shaped like a human woman. It collapsed to dust when I touched it. I uttered all the prayers I could think of and burnt it there, although I'm not a superstitious man. Not everything is intended to be comprehended. There are some things that are best left alone. Tomorrow I will close the Caldwell case. If I've made the incorrect decision, may God help me. The Missouri State Archives handwriting analysis confirmed that this document matches known samples of Holloway's writing from the period, although skeptics have questioned its authenticity, pointing out that it could have easily been fabricated by someone familiar with the case. In 2017, the last recorded encounter was when a wildlife photographer took a picture of what appeared to be a woman standing among far-off trees. The figure was partially hidden by foliage, but details such as long dark hair and 1920 seconds era attire were visible. When the photographer tried to get close, the figure fled farther into the forest at what he called an impossible speed. Looking back at his other photos from that day, he found that the same figure was in the background of multiple photos taken at various locations within a 2-hour period. In each of the images where the figure appeared, the surrounding vegetation displayed signs of distortion, such as branches bending toward the figure, leaves oriented in unnatural positions, and colors slightly shifted compared to the same species elsewhere in the frame. What was most unsettling was the gradual change in the figure itself over the series of images. In the first photograph, the form was clearly human, and in the last image, taken as the light was fading, what stood among the trees hardly resembled a human silhouette at all. These anomalies were discovered by digital imaging experts, who further examined the photographs. I've worked in national parks all over the country. The photographer, who asked to remain anonymous while sharing these photos with researchers, said, "And I've seen bears, mountain lions, even a pack of wolves once." He also spoke of a deep sense of discomfort that lingered long after he left the region. "Whatever was observing me from those trees wasn't wildlife as we know it, but I've never felt threatened by it. It was a completely different thing, and it knew me better than I did." The story of Catherine Caldwell may be merely one thread in a larger tapestry of human encounters with forces beyond our understanding. The Ozark Mountains have always held secrets, deep hollows where sunlight barely penetrates, caves that stretch for miles beneath the surface, and forests that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. The area surrounding Hollister has a long history of strange occurrences that predates the Caldwell case. Native American tribes mostly avoided parts of what is now Taney County, especially Stillhouse Hollow, which the Osage supposedly referred to as the place where the trees watch. Early European settlers documented folklore about hollow women or forest brides who would emerge from the wilderness during difficult times, bringing knowledge of medicinal plants before eventually returning to the woods, sometimes taking husbands or children with them. Although these stories were largely written off as superstition by outside observers, they continued to be told orally well into the 20th century. During the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds Folklorist Vance Randolph documented a number of accounts of encounters with what the locals referred to as tree women, or hollow people. Randolph was concerned about the consistency of these accounts across remote communities that had little contact with one another. In his private notes, but never in his published work, he wrote in 1933, "The description is always the same," he wrote. "A woman who seems human at first glance, but reveals subtle wrongness upon closer inspection. Skin that appears to change in various lights, eyes that reflect light like an animal's, and a voice that makes noises that shouldn't be in a human throat. And the woodland link, always, always. Eventually, they are supposed to return to the trees, leaving behind nothing but discarded clothing or, according to other stories, what appears to be shed skin." Randolph's collection of field recordings from the time includes one partial interview with an elderly woman who claimed to have known Catherine Caldwell. The recording is largely degraded, but one clear statement remains. She wasn't never what you'd call a natural woman. Randolph apparently abandoned this line of research after a disturbing experience of his own near Hollister in 1934, though he never documented the details. She had knowledge that no one had taught her, as well as their eyes. "I only witnessed one alteration, but it was sufficient. Some people said that Thomas had disposed of her, but they were mistaken." In 1925, whatever had left the woods in 1896 returned. The only distinction was that it knew us better the second time. A 2010 botanical survey revealed plant species growing well outside their normal ranges, including several that should not have been able to survive in the Ozark climate. More perplexing were the hybridized varieties that seemed to combine traits of multiple species in ways that conventional evolutionary biology couldn't easily explain. Environmental scientists have recently noticed unusual patterns in the forest ecosystem surrounding Stillhouse Hollow. "It's as if the forest itself has developed a form of intelligence," wrote Dr. Lauren Mitchell, the botanist who led the survey, in her report, noting that some parts of the forest showed what she called accelerated adaptability plants, responding to environmental stimuli much faster than normal evolutionary processes would allow. When soil samples from these areas were analyzed, they contained compounds not typically found in nature, including complex organic molecules with structures similar to those used in human neural transmission. However, Dr. Mitchell quickly added that such speculation went beyond the bounds of scientific observation. She suggested more research, but funding for follow-up research was denied, and she was subtly urged by university administrators to concentrate on less contentious projects. Game wardens, hikers, and forestry workers describe an awareness that seems to pervade the area, watching with detached curiosity and occasional intervention. Those who have spent a great deal of time in the forests surrounding the former Caldwell property frequently describe a sensation that defies rational explanation, a feeling of being watched by something that understands human thought but processes it through an entirely different framework. In a biography his family released privately after his passing, Park Ranger David Holcomb, who patrolled the area for 27 years until retiring in 2019, summed up the experience as follows. "You never feel alone in those woods, even when you know for sure no other person is within miles. Most of the time, it's a watchful presence, as if you were a specimen being observed, rather than a malicious one. However, there are locations when the atmosphere shifts, particularly close to that ancient hole known as Stillhouse. Time appears to slow down, the air becomes heavy, and you have the clear feeling that you're being assessed against an unknowable standard. And occasionally, just occasionally, you get a glimpse of a woman humming. You know it's time to go at that point, and you should do it fast." In 2008, 2 teenage boys from Branson went missing after telling friends they planned to camp near the old Caldwell property to see the ghost lady. 3 days later, their tent and equipment were found, abandoned but undisturbed, and a half-mile away, searchers found both boys' shoes neatly side by side at the base of a massive oak tree, but no other trace of the teenagers was ever found. For those who know the history, the woods around Stillhouse Hollow remain a place to be avoided, especially during those transitional times, dawn, dusk, and the changing of seasons when boundaries become blurred. Later, The mother of one of the missing boys stated that she received anonymous letters postmarked from various places throughout the Ozarks. The letters were written in what she thought was her son's handwriting, but they only included odd, disjointed phrases. At first, the skin doesn't fit right. Through the roots, they communicate. The official report concluded that the boys had likely become disoriented in the dense forest and died of exposure. Though no bodies were recovered despite an extensive search involving canine dogs and thermal imaging equipment. "He's still out there," she told a local reporter shortly before her passing. "Not as himself anymore, but as part of whatever lives in those trees." Authorities dismissed the letters as a cruel hoax, but the woman insisted until her death in 2015 that something in the forest had taken her son, not killed him, but transformed him into something else entirely. "I occasionally take a car out there and simply sit along the forest's edge. I sense him, observing. Not gone, yet not my boy anymore. Simply changed." Unusual concentrations of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a potent, naturally occurring psychedelic compound, were found in the soil and bark of nearby trees in the immediate area where the boy's shoes were found. Although DMT is present in many plant species around the world, the concentrations measured in samples from Stillhouse Hollow were orders of magnitude higher than any previously recorded in North America. According to an analysis of soil and vegetation samples taken during the search operation, these anomalies were intriguingly similar to those reported in Dr. Mitchell's botanical survey. Something unusual is happening in that forest. Dr. Jeffrey Harmon, a neurochemist who reviewed the analysis, concluded, "Whether it's a unique combination of environmental factors creating shared psychological responses or something that lies outside our current scientific understanding, I can't say with certainty." Harmon acknowledged that the presence of DMT alone couldn't account for the consistent nature of these experiences across decades, nor for the physical evidence associated with cases like the Caldwell disappearance. According to Harmon, exposure to such high levels of the compound could cause profound changes in perception and consciousness, which could explain reports of strange experiences in the area. However, the regularity of accounts over almost a century indicates that the issue is not only mass hallucinations or folklore. The mystery was further complicated in 2012, when workers excavated a sealed glass jar containing a bundle of papers wrapped in waxed cloth during the expansion of a campground near Table Rock Lake. The jar was determined to date from the early 1920s and contained what appeared to be research notes written by Catherine Caldwell herself, documenting her observations of plant life in the Ozarks between 1919 and 1924. Written in a precise, educated hand, the notes started out as simple botanical observations but gradually turned into something more disturbing. "The hollow oak responds to blood," Catherine wrote in an entry from May 1923. "Even a small amount, a pinprick, causes visible changes in the surrounding vegetation." Catherine also recorded experiments with extraction methods for plant compounds, the effects of various preparations on herself and animals, and increasingly bizarre phenomena associated with specific locations in the forest. The leaves face the source, branches slant downward. Partially visible above earth, the root structures appear to be reaching for the offering. The aural component is the most striking, a sound at the hearing threshold that seems almost familiar to me, like singing or whispering. According to later entries, Catherine became increasingly convinced that the forest held what she referred to as nodes of consciousness, places where the plant life had evolved a kind of collective awareness that could, under certain circumstances, interact with human consciousness, and she recorded experiments with a variety of substances that she thought might help to make this possible, such as preparations made from local fungi, certain flowering plants, and mineral compounds found in particular cave systems. Following one such experiment in October 1924, she wrote, "The boundary between self and other dissolves. I perceive the forest not as a collection of individual organisms, but as a single entity with countless expressions," she said. "What's more astounding is how it views me. Something familiar, something it remembers from a long time ago, comes to mind. The message is clear. You were once a part of us. even though it communicates through sensation rather than words. You can be once more. T believes I am practicing some form of witchcraft, she wrote in what appears to be her final entry, dated November 25, 1925. He doesn't understand that what happens in the forest is far older than any human conception of magic, Catherine wrote in the last pages of her notes, describing her growing awareness of her husband's suspicions and her fear that he intended to harm her. In contrast to Thomas's journal, which portrayed her as increasingly alien and threatening, Catherine's account depicted a woman torn between two worlds: the human society she had been brought up to inhabit, and something older calling her back to its fold. It's just a different way of living that sometimes crosses paths with ours. I've attempted to show him its beauty, but all he sees is danger. I discovered poison in my tea last night. He now keeps a close eye on me in anticipation of any evidence of his hallucinations. I can't remain. The shift necessitates sacrifice, yet the forest provides refuge. You have to give back what you borrowed. It is necessary to shed what was human. The authentication of these documents proved challenging, as few verified samples of Catherine's handwriting existed for comparison. However, paper and ink analysis confirmed that they originated from the correct time period, and the level of botanical knowledge displayed in the notes matched what would have been expected from someone with Catherine's education and interests. What remains most difficult to explain is how the jar came to be buried at a location miles from the Caldwell property, and why these particular documents survived when so many others associated with the case were lost or destroyed. Some researchers have suggested that Catherine herself might have hidden them there before her disappearance, preserving a record of her experiences separate from what would be found at the farm. Others propose a more unsettling possibility, that whatever Catherine became after leaving the farm continued to influence events long after her human life had ended, ensuring that fragments of her story would emerge at intervals calculated to maintain the mystery without ever revealing its full dimensions. By 2015, there was enough information about the Caldwell case to draw the attention of true crime writer Martin Blackwood, who started researching the case for a book tentatively titled The Woman in the Woods: The Strange Case of Catherine Caldwell. Blackwood's approach was forensic and skeptical, concentrating on the case's documented facts and trying to come up with a logical explanation for what happened in 1925, 1926. The most likely scenario is that Thomas Caldwell murdered his wife during a psychotic episode and created an elaborate cover story to justify his actions. Blackwood wrote in his research notes, "The missing skull, the ritualistic arrangement in the cellar, classic signs of a killer with delusions. All of the later added supernatural elements are simply folklore, doing what folklore does, which is to turn a tragic but ordinary crime into something that speaks to deeper cultural fears." Blackwood visited the former Caldwell property, now deep within Mark Twain National Forest, with a park ranger and a photographer, to document what little remained of the original structures, and interviewed local historians, descendants of those involved in the original case, and experts in pertinent fields such as forensic pathology, psychology, and Ozark folk traditions. 3 months into his research, Blackwood's approach to the case changed dramatically. His notes became increasingly disorganized, jumping between topics and including observations that had little apparent connection to the historical facts of the case. He began recording extensive descriptions of dreams in which he claimed to communicate with Catherine Caldwell not as a ghost, but as what he called a dispersed consciousness inhabiting multiple organisms simultaneously. In these accounts, Catherine described her transformation from human to forest mind as an arduous process of shedding individuated consciousness and merging with a vastly older and more complex awareness that existed in the network of plant life throughout the Ozarks. According to Blackwood's transcriptions of these dreams, this entity had periodically taken human form throughout history, inhabiting the bodies of foundlings or lost children who were then raised as humans until the call to return became too strong to resist. Catherine said, "The human form is limiting but instructive, because we learn from it." According to Blackwood, we recall what it's like to be confined and to see through such limited eyes. We carry that wisdom back with us when we return to the bigger self. It transforms us. The forest is altered by it. When Blackwood missed multiple deadlines and sent in chapters that were fragmented and significantly different from his suggested outline, his publisher became concerned. When he was called, Blackwood said he was on the verge of a breakthrough and that he needed to spend more time in the forest near the Caldwell property. His last email, sent at 3:17 a.m. on October 12, 2015, contained only the cryptic message: "She wasn't trying to become more like us. We were destined to resemble her more." 3 days later, Blackwood's rental car was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road near Stillhouse Hollow. His rental cabin in Hollister had walls covered with drawings of intricate root systems mixed with what appeared to be neural networks, and dozens of pages of text in an unidentified script that linguists have tentatively classified as using elements of Cherokee syllabary, combined with symbols similar to those described in the original Caldwell case. Despite a thorough search, no trace of Blackwood was ever found, and the case is still open, classified as a missing person rather than a presumed death because no remains were found. His unfinished manuscript was eventually published under the title Incomplete Investigations, The Caldwell Case and Other Ozark Mysteries, but his family objected to its publication, stating that the material had been contaminated by whatever Blackwood encountered during his research. We observe synchronized behavioral patterns across plant communities separated by significant distances, Dr. Amelia Chen, an environmental researcher, wrote in her 2019 publication of results from a 5-year study of ecosystem patterns in the Ozarks. Using satellite imagery, ground-level sensors, and analysis of historical land use records, Dr. Chen discovered what she called communication networks among seemingly disparate forest segments throughout the region. Changes in one area, such as responses to environmental stressors, would be mirrored in other areas without any apparent physical connection, Chen wrote. It appears as though data is being sent via routes that are currently invisible to us. What we're seeing suggests a level of coordination and information processing within plant communities that challenges our understanding of intelligence, Dr. Chen said, adding that these patterns centered around specific nodes, one of which aligned exactly with the location of Stillhouse Hollow and displayed unusually high bioacoustic activity, subtle vibrations produced by plant life that, when recorded and analyzed, revealed complex patterns similar to those found in certain forms of non-human communication. We typically associate consciousness with centralized nervous systems, but these findings point to the possibility of distributed forms of awareness operating through entirely different mechanisms. Science is just beginning to recognize forms of intelligence and awareness that don't match our anthropocentric models, Dr. Chen said when questioned specifically about the Caldwell case in a later interview, but she did not rule out the possibility of human interaction or even incorporation into such systems in some situations. Based only on theory, I wouldn't rule anything out. If Catherine Caldwell did have an unusual connection to the forest ecosystem, whether through neurochemical sensitivity, genetic predisposition, or some other mechanism, her experiences might represent a documented case of interaction with a non-human intelligence that science is only now beginning to recognize. The boundaries between distinct life forms are more permeable than we once believed. This viewpoint provides a framework for understanding the Caldwell case that bridges the gap between folklore and emerging scientific concepts. From Thomas's description of his wife becoming something else, to the pictographs in the cave system depicting human figures blending with plants, the case's recurrent theme of transformation suggests a phenomenon that goes beyond personal psychology and speaks to something deeper about the relationship between human and non-human life. On some nights, typically in late autumn when the leaves have fallen and moonlight reaches deep into the forest, hikers claim to occasionally hear a woman's voice singing in words that no living person can understand. A voice that sounds almost, but not quite, human. After years of studying plant communication at the University of Washington, a retired botanist named Margaret Ellison moved to Branson in 2020. After reading about the Caldwell case and Dr. Chen's research, Ellison started going to the public forest areas near Stillhouse Hollow on a regular basis, carefully adhering to Forest Service boundaries and never going into restricted areas. Ellison spent 18 months documenting unusual growth patterns in vegetation throughout the region, paying particular attention to what she called response areas, places where plants appear to respond to human presence in ways that cannot be explained by common stimuli, like shadow movement or carbon dioxide exhalation. In these areas, vegetation physically orientates toward human visitors, she wrote in her private research journal, not just in response to light or heat, but in what appears to be focused attention. The most remarkable is the recurring pattern of reaction. First observation, then what I can only characterize as recognition, and last, depending on variables I haven't yet determined, either retreat or approach. Based on her understanding of plant signaling mechanisms, Ellison started experimenting with methods of interaction, using different combinations of chemical compounds, sound frequencies, and physical contact to create what she hoped could become a form of communication. Her notes describe growing success with these methods, leading to what she called coherent exchanges where the forest responded to her signals and patterns that suggested meaningful information transfer rather than random reactions. The forest spoke back, Ellison wrote, not in words, not in sound at all, but in images that formed in my mind with a clarity I've never experienced before. When she applied a compound made from human neural proteins to the soil surrounding a particular oak tree and then played a recording of human heartbeats amplified through the ground, she witnessed a response that defied conventional explanation on April 16, 2022. The anniversary of the day Catherine Caldwell's disappearance was officially acknowledged. I noticed a young, dark-haired woman strolling amid the trees wearing clothes from a bygone age. Her visage changed from human characteristics to something else as she turned to face me. It's odd, plant-like in a manner I can't quite explain, yet not monstrous. Then I realized not via words, but through first-hand experience, that I was witnessing Catherine Caldwell in her current form, which is a hybrid of her human and forest selves. It's not malevolent, Ellison insisted in her final journal entry, just profoundly different from human consciousness. In later sessions, Ellison claimed to have developed continuous communication with this entity, learning bits of its nature and history. Her notes indicated that what started as Catherine Caldwell had merged with a consciousness that had existed in the forest for thousands of years, periodically taking human form to remember individuation and bring that experience back to the collective awareness. It has a completely different perspective on existence, identity, and time. The inherent dissonance that arises when such disparate modalities of being collide is what we perceive as terrifying or menacing. In what her notes suggested would be her most ambitious communication attempt to date, Margaret Ellison vanished on the 30th of May 2022, and her car was discovered parked at a trailhead with her research materials neatly organized inside. A simple note on the passenger seat said, "If I don't return, know that I went willingly." Those who have read Ellison's accounts with an open mind, however, have noted the accuracy of her observations and the consistency of her documented experiences with other reports spanning nearly a century. If even a fraction of what she described is true, the Caldwell case represents not just an unsolved disappearance, but a documented instance of contact with a form of intelligence that exists alongside humanity, but perceives reality through an entirely different lens. Some questions can only be answered by becoming part of what you seek to understand. Despite numerous search efforts, Ellison has not been located. Her research journals were eventually published online by her daughter, but mainstream scientific publications have largely dismissed them as the product of an aging mind influenced by local folklore and possibly early-stage dementia. The true fate of Catherine Caldwell may never be known, as the official record claims that she was killed by her husband in a fit of paranoid delusion. However, in the Ozarks, official records have never fully conveyed the reality of what exists in the shadowed spaces between human settlements. Some stories never end, some mysteries never seem to be solved, and some entities continue to walk the boundaries between worlds, long after their names have been forgotten by everyone but the most devoted seekers of hidden truths. Those who venture into the forests surrounding Hollister would be well advised to keep in mind that not everything that has a human face was born to human form. and that some vessels, once emptied, are still open to other occupants. A team from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri started a project in 2023 to digitize and preserve fragile records related to Ozark folklore, including materials related to the Caldwell case. In the process, they found a previously unrecognized audio recording made by Dr. Eleanor Marsh just before her disappearance in 1968. The recording, which was severely damaged but partially recoverable with modern technology, captured what seemed to be Dr. Marsh's final field notes, dictated as she got ready to explore an area near Stillhouse Hollow. Her voice, at first clear and professional, became more tense as the recording went on. "This area of the forest has been incorrect since before his grandfather's time," she said, adding, "The local guide refused to go with me past this point. The path ahead exhibits peculiar traits. Despite showing no signs of human involvement, the vegetation creates discrete pathways that seem to have been maintained on purpose." The recording's background noise included typical forest sounds, such as bird calls and wind through leaves, but audio experts noticed anomalies that grew more noticeable as the recording went on. Some frequencies seemed artificially suppressed, while others were amplified beyond what would happen naturally. The pattern suggested what one analyst called acoustic manipulation of the environment, as if the forest itself were regulating what sounds could propagate within it. "The temperature has dropped about 10 degrees, though I've only descended slightly in elevation." In the last minutes of the recording, Dr. Marsh reported finding a clearing that doesn't appear on any map, with a circle of stones encircling a single massive oak tree, her descriptions of which grew more fragmented as she got closer to the tree. Bark pattern forms distinct symbols similar to those reported in the Caldwell cellar. Something else. Not wind, but movement inside the trunk. A cavity is developing. She is present. Catherine is. The recording ended abruptly with what audio experts identified as a massive infrasonic event, a sound below the range of human hearing but powerful enough to disrupt the recording equipment. The final audible element was what sounded like a woman's voice, distant but clear, saying words that linguistic analysis has interpreted as, "I've been waiting for someone who could understand." The sound that still reverberates through Stillhouse Hollow is not Catherine's voice, but something older, something that was only temporarily taking on her form, something that has now returned to its original state, but still has enough memory of humanity to watch us with curious eyes from between the trees. This recording, confirmed as authentic by several independent experts, offers compelling evidence that Dr. Marsh's disappearance was related to her investigation of the Caldwell case, and that whatever she encountered in the forest that day was directly linked to the events of 1925-1926. The Catherine Caldwell case reminds us that in some remote corners of our world, the line between folklore and fact remains dangerously thin. What walks there may wear a familiar face, may even speak with a human voice, but it carries within it something fundamentally other, something that remembers when the forests were vast and unbroken, when human settlements were few and easily avoided, and when the dark spaces between trees were respected as territories where different rules apply. If you find yourself in the Missouri Ozarks, close to the forests where the Caldwell farm once stood, and you feel the weight of invisible eyes following your every move, don't turn around. The soft, rhythmic sound may be footsteps following just far enough behind to be invisible, and that whisper, almost too faint to hear, may be a voice that has spent decades perfecting its imitation of human speech, a voice that knows your name before you speak it, that remembers you from a time before you were born, that patiently waits for you to venture just a little farther from the path. Pay close attention to it the next time you go for a woodland walk. It's not just the wind blowing through the leaves, or the forest's natural settling as daylight fades. The forests surrounding Stillhouse Hollow continue to be places where the unexplained happens, with unsettling regularity, where electronic devices malfunction without explanation, where hikers experience missing time, and where the sense of being watched is so prevalent that even the most cynical tourists find themselves racing back to their vehicles before sunset. Some claim Catherine is still out there, watching from the trees, while others think what watches was never Catherine at all, but simply wore her form for a while. History may have forgotten the truth about what actually transpired in that farmhouse cellar in 1926, but something is still there. Something that takes on the form of a woman, responds to a woman's name, and bears in its impossible eyes the memory of a metamorphosis that most human minds cannot fathom. Catherine Caldwell's case isn't over. It just lingers in the gaps between recorded facts, in the shadows between trees, and in the seconds between one footfall and the next. The forest remembers what we have forgotten, and sometimes it gives that memory a voice, a form, a purpose that extends far beyond the short span of a human life. Catherine Caldwell returned to the forest in 1926, or perhaps more accurately, the forest reclaimed what had always belonged to it. In any case, something still walks the wooded hollows of the Ozarks, wearing a face that was once human, watching with eyes that never were, and it remembers everything. Keep in mind that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, but rather serve as boundaries, marking territories where human understanding falters and older, stranger truths prevail.